Next up is our video about the limbic system. And you see all the parts of the limbic system listed right here. It's this innermost part of the brain. So picture me like removing one hemisphere of your cerebral cortex so that we had a nice little window into the center of the brain. And you'll see our limbic system. Let's look at the diagram so that you can label the one in your notebook. Alrighty, so take a look at your notebook and let's click and drag everything to where it needs to be. We're going to talk first about the thalamus. Here's the thalamus right here. You have two thalami, one in each hemisphere. You actually have two of each of these structures that we're about to talk about, with the exception, I guess, of the hypothalamus. That's a good question. I imagine there's parts of the hypothalamus that are in each hemisphere as well. So here's the thalamus. So if you were to picture the brainstem, which we've already learned about, picture the brainstem coming down right here, and the thalamus sits on top of it. Right under the thalamus, which is actually really impossible for you to see on this diagram. It's so difficult because of the location of the hypothalamus to really get a good, find a good diagram for you. But that's the hypothalamus right down here. I think I'll talk a little bit more in class about how you should label this, but basically it's got to go right like underneath the thalamus, as long as you're pointing to this area underneath the thalamus. Over here is one of your hippocampi. You have a hippocampus in each hemisphere of your brain. This structure right here, hippocampus, it means seahorse. This long structure right here is known as the hippocampus. Supposedly it looks like a seahorse. I don't know if I really think so, but whatever. This little structure sitting on the end of the hippocampus is called your amygdala. I like to call her Amy when my daughters get worked up. When they get super anxious, I like to tell them to calm Amy down, because Amy is responsible for our fight or flight response, our stress response, our fear response, etc. It is almond-shaped. Amygdala means almond, and that's that little almond-shaped structure on the end of the hippocampus. So the limbic system, let's start first with the thalamus. I said that the thalamus sits right atop the brainstem. The thalamus is responsible for taking in sensory information from the brainstem. So picture sensory information like visual information, auditory information, information about hearing and taste and touch. It's all coming up through the brainstem to the thalamus. The job of the thalamus is to direct that sensory traffic to the part of the brain that processes it. So for example, visual information goes from the eyes first to the thalamus before it's transmitted back to the occipital lobe, which is responsible for our vision. That's where the visual cortex is. Same with auditory information. It comes in through the ears, we're going to learn in our next unit, before the thalamus sends it off to the temporal lobe, where the auditory cortex is and where auditory information is processed. So an analogy that you can use is back in the day, my grandparents' time, maybe your grandparents' time, maybe your great-grandparents', you couldn't just pick up a phone and call the person who you wanted to talk to. Your call had to first be routed through an operator. So you would call the operator, and the operator would route your call to the person who you want to talk to. Think of the thalamus as essentially doing the same thing. Think of the thalamus as being that operator that takes in the sensory information and sends it to the part of the brain that processes it. The only type, and I need you to make a note of this, the only sensory information that is not routed through the thalamus is smell. We're going to learn about smell, your olfactory bulbs, your olfactory bulbs, which are responsible for your sense of smell, sit right at the base of your frontal lobe. So information comes in through the nose and is processed right there. It's not routed through the thalamus. Your mnemonic for this is Hal and Amos thalamus. Hal and Amos are traffic cups, and they are responsible for directing sensory traffic to all of the different parts of the brain that processes that type of sensory information. Next up is our hypothalamus, hypothalamus. Again, I have not come up with any of these mnemonic devices, and I've linked you in your notebook to the videos that actually go with these mnemonic devices. So, hypothalamus, if I was squirting water on this llama, it might help me remember that the hypothalamus is responsible for directing our eating behavior, our drinking behavior. It helps us maintain our body temperature. So if I'm squirting the water on these llamas to cool them down, one of the things that the hypothalamus is responsible for is our ability to regulate our body temperature, control our emotions. The hypothalamus is the direct link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So if I am in a scary situation, a life-threatening situation, my amygdala is immediately going to detect that threat, send a signal to my hypothalamus, who sends a signal to the pituitary gland, the master gland of the endocrine system, and is going the body's then going to start secreting the stress hormones that are involved in the stress response, like adrenaline and noradrenaline. So the hypothalamus, you can remember as it's in charge of a whole bunch of F's. Feeding, Fahrenheit, which is body temperature, the fight or flight response, and also it's involved in sexual motivation, sex drive, and I will leave it at that. So anyway, a helpful mnemonic: picture a hypodermic needle spraying two thirsty llamas with water to quench their thirst and to cool them down. The amygdala regulates the emotions of fear and anger, and like I said already, it's responsible for our fight or flight response. So when we get anxious, when our palms start to sweat, when we start to get that funny feeling in our stomach, we start shaking when we're nervous, that's all a product of Amy, the amygdala. A mnemonic: Amy is like the jumpy superhero who tries to protect you at all costs, but often mistakes stress for real threats. So if you're stressed, calm down, Amy, is what you should say. One note about the stress response that we'll talk about later in the year: your stress response is an adaptive response. It is helpful. It's what allows us to stay alive. It's incredibly important for the survival of our species. The problem is our brain detects everyday stressors like school and work and relationships, for example, as real, actual stressors and reacts the same way, but for a prolonged period of time. And so the body's response to chronic stress, the type of stress I was just talking about, over time can really have very damaging effects on the body. Blame Amy. But also thank Amy for the fact that we are alive. All right, so the hippocampus is responsible for memory consolidation. One thing I want to clear up right now: memories are not stored in the hippocampus. Memories are stored in networks of neurons. Memories are stored in networks of neurons throughout the cerebral cortex. The role of the hippocampus is consolidation. It's the formation of new memories. Okay, so super important you understand the hippocampus is responsible for creating and storing new memories, but memories are not stored in the hippocampus. And my favorite mnemonic of all of these, and nobody ever forgets it, I get emails like, Miss Lineker, I still remember. You'll never forget seeing a hippo on campus. And that wraps up the limbic system.